Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and in this episode we'll be talking to Dave Boehnlein, co-founder of Terra Phoenix Design and author of the book Practical Permaculture. In our conversation today, Dave helps us to understand some of the basic tenets of permaculture thinking and practice. According to him, there's a place in permaculture for everyone, no matter what their skills or interests might be. In fact, he contends that this way of thinking and being is something that can help any of us to find greater meaning in our lives.
I think the idea here is that this is really important work, this is precious work, but it's also fulfilling work, right? And I think one of the big things that comes up for me is this idea of a life of meaning. Many people, that meaning doesn't come from their day job, right? So if you want to pursue that meaning, good chance that permaculture can help you find it, regardless of how you're interfacing, whether it's because you're a permaculture gardener or whether it's because you're a permaculture-focused community organizer or whether it's because you like to tinker and fix old farm equipment or whatever your angle is. There's kind of a role for anyone.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Welcome, everyone. We have a great episode today, and I have with me my sometime co-host, James Avedon. How are you doing, James?
I'm doing great and looking forward to this conversation.
James, I'm going to ask you to introduce our guest since you actually have a relationship with him.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce everybody to Dave Boehnlein. And our first question for all our guests is to have you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thanks for having me. And what I do on a day-to-day basis is actually quite variable. I'm a permaculture designer and educator. And so I will have days where I am out planting daikon radishes or pruning fruit trees or things like that. I will have other days where I'm helping to put together a permaculture design for a client, along with my partners, Doug Bullock and Paul Kearsley with our company, Terra Phoenix Design. And I'll have other days where I'm teaching. I teach at Bastyr University. I teach at the Bullock's Permaculture Homestead out on Orcas Island. And I also teach freelance at everywhere else. So working with students, teaching them how to build compost piles or teaching them how to do mapping and how slope impacts a design or any of those sorts of things. It's quite variable. And the newest mix in my mosaic of things that I do would be project management for a agriculturally focused eco-village project that I'm working on here in the Pacific Northwest with a whole crew of folks.
And you have written a book as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I guess it came out in 2015, paired up with Jesse Bloom, and we put together a book called Practical Permaculture. And the intention of that book was to be a simple, straightforward, practical guide to how to actually approach creating a permaculture design, if you so wish to do that.
So tell us about where your interests have come from. When you think about the people who have influenced you, the experiences you've had, what are some of the things that led you to have a lifestyle of really devotion to caring for the earth?
Well, if we dial back the clock all the way to when I was a kid, I was in Boy Scouts, and that meant camping trips every month and summer camp and things like that. I had a crew of really awesome leaders, and I think that really makes a huge difference in that particular program. And if you look at the Richard Louv literature, right, Last Child in the Woods, this idea that in those formative years, if you spend significant amounts of time in nature with a mentor, that kind of sets the tone for the rest of your life in terms of environmental stewardship and how you're going to behave outdoors. So for me, that was huge. It led to college where I started doing outdoor recreation, outdoor education. I led trips for college kids. I led trips for high school kids. I did trail crews with high school kids and did all that kind of stuff for a number of years. So I was pretty dedicated on the environmental stewardship program from very early on.
talk also about your mentors, because I know that you've had people speak into your life in pretty influential ways, and maybe you could tell us about those folks.
I would say one of the most pivotal mentors that I encountered was Doug Bullock, who I am now partners with in Terra Phoenix. Effectively, I was traveling in Costa Rica after I graduated from college and working on a bird research and reforestation project. While I was there, I needed to go to Panama to renew my visa. I told somebody I was going there, and they said, well, you got to swing by. There's this amazing permaculture farm down on the border. You got to check it out. I said, all right, I'll do that. What's permaculture? Never heard of it. I happened to walk into this permaculture site and catch the last 2 days of a permaculture design course that was being taught by Doug and Sam Bullock and a variety of other folks. I could just laundry list out all the different people who happened to be there that day at that course that I'm still in touch with today, and that I still have, I work with these folks, I collaborate with these folks, that sort of thing. But Doug was really the one who amazed me. And when they finished their course, my interest was piqued. They said, hey, we've got this design job down in Panama. We're heading over there. Anybody who wants to come with us and see how this really works and how we work, feel free to join us. So I said, I wasn't part of your class, but I would definitely jump along for that because I'm going to Panama anyway. So I ended up spending, it was a week, maybe a little more with them in the Bocas del Toro Islands. And I really got to see how they interact with landscapes, not just Doug, not just the instructors, but also the other people who were interested in permaculture. And that was extremely pivotal. I got to see people who were able to do what in permaculture we call reading the landscape, right? Like I remember getting in a boat and pulling up on a little tropical island and starting to walk through the rainforest there, and Doug stopping and saying, we're standing in an abandoned cacao plantation. And no one else recognized any sort of human pattern here or anything, but he was looking in the understory. He was seeing that there was actually a grid of cacao plants that were planted and how they were laid out and where they were and all that sort of stuff. And so I was convinced pretty quickly that he was a land wizard, and decided that I also wanted to be a land wizard, and I wanted to be able to read what's going on in the natural world. But in addition to that, I also got to see this host of people who were really excited about getting into it and doing the work, right? And I've talked to other people about this for quite a while, but I think there's this sort of baseline idea in our modern culture that if we want to make a difference, we have to have government or organizations or all these different entities get on board in order for us to be able to make a difference. Therefore, that leads, if that's the mentality, then, well, how do you make a difference? You write letters to your congressman, you give your donation to the conservation organization, so on and so forth. What I learned from the permaculture people was that you can actually just go out and plant trees. You can actually just go and do the work, right? And get started. And it doesn't mean we don't do all those other things, but it means that you're not so disempowered as I think that the narrative tends to lead people to believe. And so actually getting up and doing the work makes a huge difference, not just for the world, but also for yourself. So this was all things that I got to see from touching base, and then touching base with the permaculture community. And as far as Doug Bullock goes, I ended up a year later taking a full permaculture design course from him and a crew of other folks in Nicaragua. And then I moved to the Bullock's Permaculture Homestead the year after that. And that was supposed to be a 1-season deal where I was going to be an intern for a year. And 7 years later, I still lived there. And I was their education director and their webmaster and their general administrator and their intern program coordinator. And I wore many hats during that time. So I would say Doug Bullock was probably the most influential person.
So from that, the last few days of a permaculture class to getting on your way to becoming your own land wizard, you've been through quite a journey. And I'm wondering, I know you're part of the Terra Phoenix Design group, and we're having conversations with you from Circlewood about how you can come alongside us and help us think through our own design work on Camino Island. But before we talk about that a little bit, I'm wondering for our listeners who maybe haven't heard of the word permaculture before, if you could define it for us. I know this is in some ways a hard question. I've read quite a few books on permaculture and talked to people who are fully immersed in it. They frequently say, well, there are many definitions or it's hard to define. How would you define it for our listeners?
Sure, I'd be happy to try. So permaculture, when I look at it and what it offers us, permaculture is a design field, right? We are a design modality for trying to make change. And within that context, we have a inherent challenge, right? If we talk about other design fields, if I ask you what an engineer does, I bet you could answer that question. If I ask you what an interior designer does, I bet you could answer that question. Software designers, architects, so on and so forth. And then you get to permaculture, and it's sort of like, it doesn't say what it does specifically. So what I like to tell people is that just like all those other designers, we have a very common pathway in that we are attempting to achieve a goal or solve a problem by following a process that we use in order to get there. And that's true for all designers, right? For us, however, whatever that goal is that we're trying to accomplish, a huge part of it that's sort of baked into the permaculture pie here is stewardship of the earth. How can we preserve ecological function? And a term that I really like that I can't remember where I first read it or picked it up, but it's the idea that how can we create human habitat within the context of ecological function. And I really like using the term human habitat because people usually think of the word habitat, they think of wildlife. But the reality is we also require habitat. And if we create our habitat at the expense of everything else around us, it turns out our habitat doesn't necessarily function all that well. It makes us sick. We don't have our basic needs met, right? So permaculture, regardless of whether you're trying to create a permaculture homestead for a rural person, or you're trying to figure out a permaculture approach to a community garden, or you want to open the nation's first permaculture bowling alley, whatever it is, we've got a design process, and we can help you figure out how to do that in a way that meets your needs while still allowing ecological function to happen.
With that broad-ranging approach, could you paint a picture of what that might look like for, let's say, a homestead on a couple of acres?
What I would say is if you look at Practical Permaculture, the whole second half of the book, what we did was we laid it out in some basic topic areas. And any good permaculture design should really be addressing all of those topic areas. Food production and landscape, livestock and wildlife, the built environment, buildings, water, soil, waste systems. How are we handling in a conventional context would be considered waste, right? Which often in a permaculture context is a resource. So if you're thinking about this homestead, we'd be looking at what's going on here, what would be occurring here if there were no people, right? If this was just a natural environment, what would be happening here? How can we play off of that? What is this environment telling us about how water moves through the site? What is this environment telling us about all these different things? And at the same time that I'm looking at the environment and we're doing the landscape reading piece, we're also talking to the people who are involved and trying to figure out what their goals are, right? And so simultaneously, we approach this from two different angles. There is what we call intentional design, right? And that's where the intentions of the people who want to be here predominate. And the intention of someone might be to have a big garden. And therefore, we're going to cut down this tree that's shading the garden in order to allow it to flourish, right? There's also conditional design, where we're saying, okay, where does our design and our human interface here change in order to fit more holistically into what's already happening, right? And we have tools to help us figure out when to use one type of design versus the other. So if we're talking about a small family homestead, there would be a lot of time spent asking the people who are running that homestead, what's important to you? What are your goals? Do you want to produce all the eggs your family consumes? Are you grain growers? Do you want to be baking bread from grain that you grew every day? To what degree are you interested in resilience in the face of a disaster, natural disaster, right? So depending what that person says about those things, that would sort of drive a lot of the intentional part of our design. And then we'd be looking at the actual site itself for the conditional part of the design, right? And so we have this, it's almost like we have two clients in every design. We have the people, and then we have the land itself.
I really loved that part of the book, actually, that you were advocating for learning how to listen to the land. It wasn't just listen, because I think we've lost the art of listening. We don't know how to read landscape, especially those folks who've not grown up with that sort of natural lived-in familiarity. But there are signs, there are ways to discern, I think, that are not evident and obvious. And I feel like I have a lot to learn in this. But for me, I think one of the moments when I realized that this was true was when I moved into my current house about 4 years ago. The landscaping was all lawns and sprinklers and sculpted bushes and casseron sprinkled on those bare earth places to keep the weeds from going. So I knew I needed to get the land to a different place. It felt like it was enslaved somehow, just like laboring under this artificialness. But there was a moment in the winter, our first winter, when there was a bank of bushes against the fence, and suddenly these ducks were appearing. And all winter long, they would just hang out, like walk around the grass. And I thought, why are they here? I would go any place but here if I were a duck. It turns out that behind the bank of bushes, all winter long, there was a pond that had formed. And so I thought, all right, what's going on here with a pond in my backyard? And I started asking around some of the old timers who'd been there for a long time. And they said, well, for better or for worse, your property is built on a filled wetland. So they put in piers and gravel and a lot of dirt, and then they built your house. So that made me sad, but then it also gave me a little hope, because I thought, what could I do to actually let the land be more of what it wants to be? And so my whole project since then has been a rewilding of my backyard. It can't be a wetland unless they come with a big excavator, but when the pond comes and the ducks come, I let them be. But I would say that for folks who, like me, maybe don't have that much familiarity with reading, with listening to landscape, where does one start? Where do you get those skills?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's been a long time since I first heard the term reading the landscape, which is terminology from the permaculture literature. I actually take that quite literally. Just like, let's say there was a book and you wanted to have the knowledge that was in that book, but the book is written in a language you don't know. It's the same exact process, right? It's like when people who haven't put any time towards trying to understand what's happening in nature go for a walk in the park. Everything they see is just random, right? The birds are chirping randomly. The rabbit is running away randomly. The leaves are blowing randomly. Everything is happening. It's just a bunch of random stuff. And you can't really appreciate it on any level beyond maybe appreciating the beauty of the script in this book that you can't read. If you really want the knowledge in that book, you have to actually learn the language though, right? And in this context, the way to learn that language, there's a number of different ways. And you kind of have to do more than one of them. So one of those ways is start reading about ecology, get some field guides, learn what things are called and learn how they relate to the things around them. There's an entire field of study out there at this point called nature awareness, right? And there's everybody from John Young to a lot of the Wilderness Awareness School, Alderleaf Wilderness College. There's a ton of schools up here, Trackers Northwest, so on and so forth. Tons of different schools that teach these skills, and they help people understand what are these plants and how have people used them historically. It ties together all kinds of things from survival skills to observation and naturalist skills, that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, what I have found is if you really want to have a good, keen understanding of how our landscapes work, there is no substitute for dirt time. You can't just read about it. You can't just pick up a book. You have to actually go out and do it. And so for many of these nature awareness programs, one of the practices that they do is called a sit spot. And that is where you pick a spot near your home, in the park down the road, wherever it is. It doesn't have to be complete pristine wilderness, right? But pick a spot outside and go and sit there for an hour a day, 5 times a week or something like that. And after you do that for 2 years, you're going to start to have a more visceral understanding of what's going on around you, especially if you're journaling about what you saw. And then you're taking what you saw and you're going back and you're researching it and you're looking it up and you're getting more information, right? So that becomes a part of becoming a well-rounded naturalist effectively. And something that I once heard a naturalist friend of mine say, who sort of crosses the boundaries from naturalist work into permaculture. And he said, of all the permaculturists I've met, the best permaculturists were all naturalists first. They were all like out in the forest looking at bugs under logs and trying to figure out the name of the shrubs and bushes and doing the naturalist skills piece. Because then when you come into permaculture is all about how are we going to intervene in this, right? It's pretty hard to make a coherent intervention if you don't understand what's going on. You'd mentioned herbicides and pesticides, right? That I think is a pretty clear symptom of that thinking where it's like, I don't understand what's happening, but I don't want that thing here. So let's take this really reductionist approach.
Mm-hmm. So I want to push on something there. I'm hearing you use words like visceral, like spending time, like journaling. And these are words that verge on the world of relationship, on the verge of personal connection. And I'm just wondering, I mean, many of our guests will say that it is all that, and it's also discerning on some other level that really has to do with considering the earth, the natural world, as full of beings, really, right? It's not a purely scientific approach, but rather more of a relational approach. And I'm wondering where you stand on that.
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct, right? And if depends who you want to look to, what philosopher you'd like to discuss that has said just as much throughout time. And a book that I read recently that was extremely influential was by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but we're looking at this, like, she's a botanist, right? And so is very familiar with Western science. She's also a native person from here in North America who brings in native ways of knowing and understanding and things like that. And it really becomes quite clear that reciprocity is one thing that she focuses on, right? And not just looking at the land as your extractive resource that you can do whatever you want with, but something that you're in relationship with. And if you go all the way back to when I was rock hopping on the Wolf River in northern Wisconsin as a kid, I was developing patterns, right? There is room in this discussion for both the intellectual and the intuitive. And I personally believe that the more time you spend in nature, the more time you're out there getting that dirt time. It's not like you don't even have to be consciously thinking about it. It's fueling your intuition, right? The more experience you have, the more understanding you have, whether it's in your bones and your body and knowing whether or not you can make that leap from one rock to the next, or if you're going to get wet, or whether it is the sounds that are coming in, or whatever it is. And for me, where that really hit home was coming out here to the Northwest. I got into going out and observing wild mushrooms all over when I lived in the Midwest. And I brought that passion for mushroom hunting out here with me. And there are times where I will walk through the woods in the fall, and for no discernible reason, I could not tell you what just happened or what changed or what the hallmark is. There'll be times where I'm walking down the trail and I will stop and I will say, this feels like mushrooms. I'm going to step off the trail and take a peek. And I believe that is the role of intuition, right? It's not all something that you write on the page. And I think that's something that we find in most traditions that have a higher degree of respect for nature than what we find in standard operating procedure, Western culture. They have something like that. It is a relationship.
Dave, I want to go back to your comment about a sit spot. One of the silver linings that I found during this time of coronavirus is I found a sit spot on my front porch where there's a couple of red chairs looking out over my front lawn and down our street. And I, along with usually my 6-year-old son, Teddy, have sat there now for many hours since last March, because in some ways we don't have other options. Or from another perspective, we've been freed to do that. And we've been doing it long enough to notice some cyclical things, like the chickadees that were there in the spring disappeared for a while. And then all of a sudden, a flock of chickadees was there for several weeks, but they were smaller. And we were wondering, are these the offspring? Is this the next generation coming back to visit and to visit us, perhaps? And it made me think about the culture part of permaculture, in that to take that time required for us an outside force. What about permaculture have you found critiques perhaps dominant Western culture? What about it to say yes to a permaculture worldview and practice? What do you think we need to say no to?
Oh boy, I think you're right to think about it from this culture angle, right? Because the term permaculture, when Bill Mollison and David Holmgren coined that term, they were referring to permanent agriculture. And I don't think it took very long where they realized the kinds of things they were talking about were really about permanent culture. And I don't mean permanent. Sometimes people take the word permanent to mean unchanging, monolithic, stationary. We're talking about permanent as in we'll be able to continue existing in perpetuity, right? And that means rolling with the punches and changing as we go and growing, right, and evolving. The big thing that stands out to me that it really is a hallmark of sort of Western thinking is reductionism, right? And the idea of it's easier to solve a problem if we throw away more pieces If we can really simplify this problem down and put on our blinders, then we can start to solve this problem. And we can get a nice, tidy number at the bottom of the page that tells us what to do, right? And that is wholesale counter to our approach in permaculture, which is all about holistic thinking. It's not how many pieces of the puzzle can we throw away. It's about how many pieces of the puzzle can we keep in our brain before it gets too complicated to manage. But we want to try and keep all the puzzle pieces there. And I mean, our economic system is one of the places we can really see this, right? We have this economic system that says, the bottom line. The fact that we even have a term, the bottom line, implies that there's just one. And it implies that there's only one thing that matters, and that is, are you profitable or not? And it's really, really easy to look profitable when you're able to externalize environmental harm onto poor people who live in the Mississippi River Delta, or sickness in that case, right? Or when you can basically take and throw into the public sphere costs and not pay them, right? And this is a live political discussion today. Like, people are wondering, well, why don't rich people pay any taxes? Why are the corporate taxes so low? Why do we have a corporate tax rate that's way less than half of what it was just a half a century ago, right? And all of these things make sense if you're willing to throw out vast quantities of information and the lives of people and the lives of wildlife and special places that can't be recovered once they're damaged and all those things. So I think from a permaculture perspective, if you want to take one thing away, like this idea of holistic thinking, and we don't get to throw pieces away. We don't get to throw justice under the bus. We don't get to throw away environmental quality. We don't get to throw away people's health just to make the equation something that works out on paper.
As the Earth Keepers podcast grows, we are adding listeners from all over the world. Here's a message sent by Olcay, an Earth Keeper who lives in Turkey.
Hi, this is Olcay Balıtatlı from Turkey. I live in a small coastal city on the aging coast of the country. I'm not sure if this is unique to my country, but greatest challenge comes from the financial sector, which is driven by greed in terms of protecting nature and the environment. In one word, this podcast gives me hope for the future of my children. I appreciate listening experiences of people from different cultures and their challenges. I can see that there are lots of people who have been working for a better world out there. It inspires me personally to care for the environment rather than waiting for someone else to do this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olcay, for your encouraging words and for joining the global community of Earth Keepers. We invite any of our listeners to share a quick reading with us from wherever you live in the world. Go to circlewood.online/earthkeepers and let us know about what earth keeping looks like in your environment. So, Dave, I have been reading your book and enjoying it very much. And one of the things I really love about it is summed up closer to the beginning of the book, where you say our intention is to make permaculture approachable and inspirational. We have written this book for a wide range of readers. And then you go on to talk about not just different kinds of readers, but different kinds of climates, different kinds of ecologies. And somehow that made me relieved in some ways, because I have to say that in some cases, my exposure to permaculture has left me a little intimidated, honestly, because there is a lot of complexity, or at least there can be, as people try to get their heads around whole systems and all the moving parts. But I think that part of me has wondered, are the barriers too high in some cases to entering to permaculture as a practice, as a lifestyle, as a value system even? Your book, though, it does not shame people. I really love it that you say that here are so many ideas that you could look at, but you don't have to do all these things. You don't have to create a whole system tomorrow. You can start somewhere, right? You can begin to build and learn and gradually move into that world. And I'm wondering, how do you help people to do that, to get over maybe some of their fear and intimidation, and really to think about what are some starting places in terms of people who don't know that much about permaculture?
It's interesting, since I do both education and design, there's different approaches to dealing with that complexity on both ends. And so as a designer, one thing that we often produce with the plans that we create is what we call an implementation plan. And I guess there's two pieces of information here. Number one, there's an implementation plan, and that says, okay, you've got this integrated master plan with all this complexity and all these different pieces. On day one, just focus on phase one. Just focus on these things. Once these things are good, then you can start thinking about all these other really complicated ideas. But we try to break it down into an approachable, bite-sized process, because we know that if we overwhelm people, they just won't do it. Right? They won't get started at all. And as an educator, I think a big part of the idea here is we want to make it really appealing to do this, right? And I think at the end of the day, part of what really makes it appealing is that it's not just about, well, I have to sacrifice in order to make a better environment and a better world for our kids. Newsflash, permaculture is fun, right? The people who are involved with permaculture have fun, right? If we think about it, I'll think back about my dad, right? And my dad worked a 40-hour-a-week job and went to his job and did his thing. I don't believe his job was fulfilling for him at all. And why did he do it? He did it so that he could come home and do on the weekends what permaculturists do all the time, right? Work in the garden and do projects and build stuff and all that sort of thing, right? And so for me, permaculture is incredibly fun. Permaculture has an entire community building component. So I think, it not only does it have all these sort of physical things that we approach and that we do, but we also have this idea that we're doing it with other people, and we're hopefully having richer relationships with other people. And we're hopefully learning more, and hopefully doing it in such a way that it means we do less work. And although most of us who create systems that do less work just find new things to get involved with so that we end up doing the same amount of work anyway. But I think those are really pieces that we want to approach. And I think learning something new is always overwhelming, right? For most people, it's like, especially depending who you're comparing yourself to, right? And it's something I know I have issues with, right? The whole imposter syndrome thing. If you're comparing yourself to somebody who's done something for 20 years before you, and you're like, oh man, I don't know nearly as much, or I don't have nearly the same knowledge, then there would never be another generation of flamenco dancers or professional bowlers or permaculturists, right? If we weren't willing to undertake the work. So I think the idea here is that this is really important work. This is precious work, but it's also fulfilling work, right? And I think one of the big things that comes up for me is this idea of a life of meaning. Many people, that meaning doesn't come from their day job, right? So if you want to pursue that meaning, good chance that permaculture can help you find it, regardless of how you're interfacing, whether it's because you're a permaculture gardener, or whether it's because you're a permaculture-focused community organizer, or whether it's because you like to tinker and fix old farm equipment, or whatever your angle is. There's kind of a role for anyone.
Yes, and I think in my introduction to permaculture and thinking about it in my own life, in my household, I think I am encouraged in that you can apply this on a very small scale to begin with, where I don't have to transform every part of my home, every part of my family system right away. But maybe what happens if I look at one area and think of it in as complex a way as possible? So for instance, for me, it's one of the things that Forrest has helped me with is to transform some of my green grass into native plantings. And that involved a process of asking, well, why would I do that? And why would I do the work to do that? Because it was a lot of work to sheet mulch the whole thing, to find plants and dig holes and all of that kind of stuff when grass was there and it was not doing well, but I didn't have to do a lot to it. Now that I'm on the other side, I can see, wow, I've put something in place that doesn't need a lot of my time and attention because it feels like it's meant to be there. It's taking care of itself because it belongs. And I maintained a pathway for my kids to run through it because their needs are important too. I extended a small grove of trees out a little bit because that seemed to be what it wanted to have happen. And I could see just in this small little project, my mind beginning to shift and understand things a little bit better. And it took slowing down. It took labor. But now that I'm beginning to be on the other side of it, like you, I'm like, okay, it's the next project because this was kind of fun because we've put something into motion that just feels right. And it's rewarding that way.
I think that's awesome. And I think, so there's two things that come up for me. One of them being, if somebody shows any interest on anything that's going to make the world a better place, let's encourage that. Whether it's how you want to address your front lawn, or whether it is putting a rain barrel in, or whatever it is. If you're going to do something that makes the world a better place, we have to do something, right? I think this idea in permaculture that we talk about a lot, observation. And I think rightly so, David Holmgren, back in around 2006, he sort of put the word out. No, it's observe and interact, right? Just like I said earlier, there's no substitute for dirt time. If you want to get an understanding of the sheet mulching process and the whys and the wheres, you got to go out and do the sheet mulching process, right? And you got to observe what happens afterwards. And it's kind of how everything in the world works, right? You have to do something in order to get the feedback to know how to do it better the next time, or to have a greater understanding of how it goes. And the other thought that comes up for me is this idea. You'll often hear permaculturists talk about being generalists. In a world where I think generalist knowledge is not valued as much as it used to be, specialist knowledge is really valued, right? Permaculturists is really saying, no, we actually need the generalists too. The generalists hold a really important place because they're the ones who have enough understanding of all the different parts that they can make them work together, right? So what I often encourage my students to do is, like, when you finish taking a permaculture course, when you're ready to move on and figure out what to do in permaculture, like here, Forrest, you're reading the book right now. Think about whatever part of that book was the most exciting to you and put a bunch of energy there, right? If, let's say, the thing that was really exciting to you is compost and worm bins, go make some worm bins and make the best worm compost anyone in Western Washington has ever had, and just go for it, right? And the other place to put your time and energy is in whatever thing made you uncomfortable, whatever thing you said, oh, that's not my thing, right? Because if you want to be a good generalist, it means we're always looking at where our skill set is lacking, and we're trying to bring that up to a baseline that allows us to function and have a perspective and utilize whatever that content is. And for me personally, that was business. If you met Dave, the college kid, the idea that I would run a business and I would be taking care of contracts and having phone calls with lawyers and doing all that kind of stuff, I would have been like, no way, man. Business is not where it's at. And ironically, that attitude, if I had maintained that attitude, it would have stopped me from doing what I want to do. And it would have stopped me from moving forward with all these grand plans I have. So I had to embrace the idea of learning something about business and learning something about how businesses work and that sort of basic skill set. And for other people, that's going to be learning how to grow peppers. And for other people, that's going to be learning how mechanical systems work. And for other people, I think for a lot of people, like, how does electricity work is a huge obstacle. And the more we learn about those things, the cool thing is, for the things that you're less comfortable with, they rotate through time, right? As you start to build up your comfort level on electrical systems, now maybe electrical systems aren't your weak point anymore. Maybe now your weak point is compost. So you boost up your compost. And then maybe after that, those things are both pretty good now. And so now what do we boost? We boost our social equity piece and try to figure out how to create more justice and how we can make our businesses and our permaculture farms places that offer more opportunities for justice, that sort of thing. So there's always going to be something that is not your bag. Hopefully you can put a little bit of time there and get big gains so you can go back to spending a huge amount of your time doing the things you're really passionate about, but with this generalist outlook that's really helpful.
I think one thing I'll point out to complete James' story of his own learning is, I think that we can also be attentive to those signs of change and the signs of hope, even by the smallest efforts that we make. James's backyard is no primal forest or anything, right? But it's more what it wants to be, I think, than it was before. And the other day, he had 2 bobcats in his yard. And that to me is a sign, those are the things that give me hope when I say, this is worth it. It's worth the work. It's worth the change, as small as it might seem. 2 bobcats, that's a big sign. And I was out in my yard yesterday, just sitting there. So it was a nice sunny day. And I realized that all the bushes were moving, but it wasn't windy at all. I thought, what the heck? So I just sat and looked, and seriously, every bush, every plant, I let all of my perennials kind of go to seed. I don't cut anything down until next spring. But I planted a lot of things that have seeds on them, and the bushes were full of birds, tiny little birds and big birds. And when I watched, there was even a small hawk of some sort that was kind of like stalking along the ground looking for one of those birds. But that to me was my reward. It was my sign of hope. It's like, oh, okay, right? If I pay attention, I can be reminded of why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, that's actually kind of a perfect case in point with, well, number one, imagine sharing those experiences with other people who this isn't on their radar, right? Like if James can tell his neighbor, hey, I got bobcats in my backyard. And they're like, I've never seen a bobcat here. I would love to see that. Maybe then they decide to do their backyard, right? If, people want to see birds and hawks and all, like, imagine bringing people over and just have them sit on your porch and having a conversation about whatever you talk about, and then just pointing out these cool things that are happening every once in a while. Can we get people to come to the table and say, like, well, how do I get that for myself? How do I have these experiences? Because at the end of the day, those two experiences that you're talking about, those reflect something that a huge number of people in modern society, particularly modern Western society, never experience. And it comes right back to this nature awareness component, right? And the idea that if you are so unfamiliar with nature that your movements and your behavior when you're in nature chases everything away before you ever get a chance to see it. If you're eliminating the habitat in your backyard, you never see anything. Like, there's tons of people who go hiking or go to the national parks or whatever, and they never see any wildlife. They never see any nature. They don't really get to appreciate the awesome parts of it. It's like they kind of like hear in books or hear on TV or whatever that bobcats exist, but they've never seen one. If you want to see them, you have to change. You have to shift things such that your impact is less than your awareness. So simultaneously, we expand our awareness and then we retract our negative impact. And where that ultimately leads you is compassion. The point where you actually pull your impact in and you start to see what's going on in nature around you. And all of a sudden you see the bobcats run by, and all of a sudden you can, so birds, when they make sounds, they're making them for a reason. There's an entire field of study called bird language. You can listen to the birds and determine what's going on out in nature, right? And I think there's this point where once you realize how much is happening and how much you've missed and how much impact you've had on all these things that are around you, it's almost enough to bring you to tears, because we don't even know. Most people have no idea the impact they're having on the world around them. And to me, that's where the tires really hit the road. And everything I talked about going back to childhood and Richard Louve's work and all that kind of stuff is we need people who actually can't go and do destructive environmental things because it hurts them too much. We require compassion. That is what has to, that's like a precursor for somebody to care, right?
I'm glad you said that, because when I was sitting there listening to the birds, the feeling I had was the feeling akin to being in love. I mean, it was that emotion. It was just love. And I felt the moment in a way that I wasn't ready to share with you a few minutes ago. But if you're talking in those terms, I really agree with you. I think that that's what it comes down to, is compassion and care and relationship.
Yeah. I mean, once you understand your impact, how could you go and destroy something's habitat or make it, like, just imagine every time you walk down the trail and something runs away from you, it is running away from you because you are scarier than whatever the unknown is that's over there that might eat it, right?
Mm-hmm,
like that's a huge, like, that is nature casting a pretty broad judgment on the human species.
So Dave, what these days causes you to despair? And then correspondingly, where are you finding your hope?
Well, I think on the despair comment, I think one thing that I ponder quite frequently is this idea that we're in the information age, right? And people have access to so much more information than they ever had before. And some of that information is true, some of that information is not. Most of that information is skewed, right? And what person actually has the time or bandwidth to sift through it all? So I think we're actually, like, I look at it and I'm like, I don't know how anybody, if you ever wonder, put it this way, in a world with this much information, it's totally possible to only listen to information that confirms your biases.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just like surround yourself with information that never explores an alternate perspective. You can listen to information that just vilifies certain people, and you could literally go your whole life without ever being exposed to anything else, because that's what's coming through on your chosen news feed, or that's what's coming through on your social media or whatever. And I don't honestly know how to work with that. That's something that I think is a very tricky thing, is this idea that we're awash in information, and it just, unless you quit your job and you just spend all day fact checking, how do you ever get to the bottom of all that information? That's really a challenge, because if we think about permaculture, which is sort of an implementation on the field of systems thinking, right? One of the keys of systems thinking is it's really critical that everybody has the same information. No information is hidden. It's not like, well, these elites have access to the information and these people don't. Everybody gets the same information. And if you don't have it that way, then you can't make good decisions together. We have a system where everybody has different information, right? And so I don't know, and that's one that I just don't know how to fix that issue. And that's a really challenging thing to try and move forward from. I think that's what drives a huge portion of the polarization that we see, right? It's pretty hard not to be polarized when all you're exposed to is this perspective, right? And the question for me would be, can people look and find components of people they don't relate to that actually fit their understanding, or, legitimate concerns about not being heard? I think there's a huge amount of people who feel unheard, regardless of what side of what political sphere you're on. And there's people who aren't heard. And sometimes those people, I think, have attached their not being heard to really unfortunate things, right? Like, I think I have to imagine, like, it's got to be a fascinating thing, and there's probably people studying it, but like, what makes someone decide that like white supremacy is a good idea, right? Like, I'm not sure what makes someone decide that, but I have the feeling it's related to trauma, and I have the feeling it's got a pretty big mental health component to it. And so again, I don't know how to solve those things. But as far as what I see as points of hope, I see permaculture having this tool set. And I think the tool set is something that, because it can be applied to just about anything, right? If you want to take permaculture principles and you want to reorganize your closet a more efficient way, you can do that. If you want to take the permaculture concept and lay out your garden in a way that's more productive and more ecologically aligned, you can do that. If you want to take the permaculture concepts and apply them to social organizing, I think we can do that there as well, right? And so from where I sit, I feel like permaculture has been growing in popularity and has been getting more attention pretty much steadily since 2006. I feel like it's just been sort of growing and growing, and more people getting interested. So I really look forward to seeing how permaculture, what can we offer to social movements? What can we offer to environmental movements, conservation movements? What can we offer to people exploring alternative economics? And how can our approaches dovetail with all of those? And if nothing else, how can we incorporate the best ideas that reflect care of people, care of earth? How can we incorporate that stuff into permaculture in a way that brings it to light for a lot of people who may not be familiar with it?
We've been in conversation with permaculture expert Dave Boehnlein. If you want to know more about his work, you'll find information and links in this episode's show notes. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. And please share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.